was born in New Britain, Connecticut, which is a small community halfway between New York City and Boston. During an important part of the last century, it was the hardware city of the world, because most of the hardware for America was manufactured there. Stanley tools, Fafner bearings, many, many industries were there. And that town consequently attracted hundreds of thousands of immigrants coming from Europe to work in the factories to manufacture the hardware to keep America going. So I was there for my first 18 years until I went to Syracuse University in upstate New York near the Canadian border. I went to Syracuse in 1963, just 2 months before the JFK assassination. The most powerful day in my life before 9/11 occurred. It was the same feeling that everyone had. Everyone had an empty, hollow, lost feeling of disbelief and dismay. The university was closed. All the students were sent home several days early for the Thanksgiving holiday, and nobody was even able to speak. It was just beyond everyone's belief. It was an amazing place because there is where I met David Ross, who later rented my apartment when I had a house sale and moved to Mykonos, Greece for a year. And also I met Bill Viola there, who was younger than both of us, who was one of the first video artists in America. And I met Jim Harithis there at the Everson Museum. So Jim hired David as the first video curator in America. And Bill Viola is now the world's premier video artist anywhere he goes. He just had a magnificent show, I believe, in Milan last year, a retrospective of his work.
Yep.
And so David and Bill and myself and Jim were all there at the same time. Primarily it was Buckminster Fuller's Synergetics. And I was blessed with being able to hear him speak at Syracuse more than once. And he was so brilliant, you had to pay attention absolutely every moment to what he was saying because he was putting out so much information. But it was so early in the age of technology that instead of a smartphone on his wrist, he had 6 wristwatches that he wore constantly. And every wristwatch had the time in a different time zone around the world. But at that particular time in history, that was the only way you could get it, was 6 different watches. You couldn't have a watch with multiple movements. There was no smartphones, no nothing. So it was that long ago. Primarily his book on the synergetics and Marshall McLuhan's book, The Medium is the Message. Today it's still a very valid book. It's a seminal book. It's at the root of everything that's happened since then. Well, that's when I started first making assemblage art. And my first assemblages were, I would say between 65 and 70. And I've continued since then to this day still doing assemblage work. Any box in the world with objects in it comes after Cornell. He was the one who invented the form. The prime thing that I discovered is that the more you do it, the easier it gets, and as you do it more and more and more, you find out that some pieces simply fall together. They fit so perfectly you cannot resist putting the things together. And there are some pieces that I have that I've carried around America for 20 and 30 years in my collection, and I save them and I save them and I save them until the day that they are perfect and they find their mate and they fall together perfectly and they become a wonderful work of art. So nothing can be forced. If it doesn't fit easily, it doesn't fit. Around 1970 or so, when I got my degree from Syracuse, I had a big house sale in a beautiful apartment I had. I rented the apartment to David Ross and his wife. I sold everything I owned and I moved to the island of Mykonos in Greece, because at the time Richard Nixon was president of America, and I was so repulsed by the fact that he was president and what he represented. I wanted nothing more to do with American politics. So I sold everything and I left the country and went to Mykonos, and I was never planning on coming back. I stayed there for 1 year, and then I found out that it was impossible to find work there because the Greeks only gave work to Greek citizens. So I was able to screen print some t-shirts, do some screen printing of other things, sell a little artwork here and there, but not enough to make a living. So I thought if I had to work to make a living somewhere, I should at least be working someplace where I understood the language. So I came back to America. In Santa Barbara in 1980, I realized that I needed to reach out to exchange ideas with other artists, because the community of Santa Barbara was very small, very limited. People outside of, let's say, the community of Santa Barbara, the community of Victoria, the community of Houston or New York or anywhere, artists anywhere in the world. It was interesting, though. Years later, I realized that the people who participated had to be people that could do an addition of work and send it to me without being paid, because each artist was responsible for action at the point of origin. Didn't matter if they were in Tokyo, Germany, Italy, Spain, South America, whatever. Every artist was responsible for their own production. And the way I set it up was that every artist, any month that had a page in any book ever, would get one of the finished books in return with the work of all the other artists with theirs. So they were exchanging one edition of work for a finished book with the work of all the other artists combined. It was social networking before the modern day technological term of social networking was even thought of or invented or coined or used. I was never interested in resumes, never. I was only interested in the quality of the work. An example would be in the first 2 years in Santa Barbara, I also owned the largest gallery in the community, which was a 3,000 square foot contemporary art gallery in Santa Barbara. And I believe the second or third show in that gallery was a one-man show of 3,000 square feet of drawings by a professor from the University of California in Santa Barbara. His large-scale drawings, which were 8 feet tall, 4 feet wide. And we mounted all 3,000 square feet with his drawings that were all 8 feet tall on 14-foot high walls. It was a beautiful show. And at the time, it didn't even matter to me that he was openly gay. This was 1982. And that was still quite a big issue with many, many people. And 30 years later, he said to me, just about a year ago, he said, you know, over the years, I've often thought about how brave you were to give me that show in that climate when things were just so difficult for gay people. And also, he's the same person that brought Herbert Breyer into the gallery, who was one of the founders of the Bauhaus. Well, I was trying to be as democratic and all-inclusive as I could be, which is why the main criteria was the quality of the work, period. There were a couple of cases where I had to send back editions of work because of the political content. There was one time when somebody from Spain sent me 200 pages of meticulously hand-cut, precise, perfect, labor-intensive swastikas. 200 of them. When I first started the magazine, the first issue was a 4-page newsletter. I did it at the post office with a roll of nickels at the post office copy machine. There was no email, there was no color copiers, there was nothing except that machine at the post office. And I mailed them out to friends just to test the climate, to see the reaction. And the timing was perfect, because what I found out was everybody needed that. They needed to exchange their ideas. So then I went from 35 to 50 to 75 to 100 to 150 and finally 200. Well, my degree from Syracuse was in graphic design, and I never had any experience with books or bookstores or publishing, however. So I was a designer and an artist myself, but I was not a book publisher. Edition of Art Life 25 years later, inside this last edition is the entire issue number 1. All 4 pages are the opening of the final issue. So you'll see on the cover here, we have a 2-pound, 1 kilo ceramic tile with a formula on it. And the formula reads, art is to life as life is to art. No, the frame is wood, but the ceramic tile is high-fired glazed tile on a hardcover in a wooden frame with a screen-printed headline. That was issue number 275/6. And inside that issue, the first 4 pages of that same issue is a reproduction of issue number 1 with the same graphic design, the same formula, the same drawing, and the same hand. The reaction was very good. It encouraged me to do number 2 and number 3 and number 4. It encouraged me to keep going, because what I discovered was that every artist and every poet had the same need to communicate with other creative people. At that time, I did everything over the phone, because when I first started Art Life, there was no email, no computers, no nothing. So my equipment for starting this project for 25 years was a push-button telephone and a Rolodex. That was my equipment. So I did everything over the phone in those days, or by going to artists' studios and talking to them. One thing that people always ask me, well, do you have a theme for every month? And right from the very beginning, I said, no, no, no. There was never a theme for any issue ever. It was always stream of consciousness coming from the artist or the poet. It was always what was going on in their mind in their life, in the world at that time. So, it was a representation of the mind of the artist. And right from the very beginning, from the very first issue to the very last issue, on every cover, it always said, communication for the creative mind. From number 1 to number 276, communication for the creative mind. Always. And it was always stream of consciousness, what the artist was doing in their studio at the time, what the poet was thinking at the time, every personal issue, every social issue, every political issue, every global issue. And also, before I did this, I didn't understand global consciousness. It was through this that I discovered global consciousness, because every month, when we assembled the 10,000 pages a month, there would be pages. When I put them together, they would form a narrative. And every time, there would be pages that would go together as if the two artists had talked to each other and collaborated. But that was impossible because they were on opposite sides of the world. So I discovered that it didn't matter where the artists were. It was the global consciousness that was being communicated, because so many artists and poets were thinking of the same issues. If you want to label it, you could use that. That would be one of many labels that it is. So I always felt that every person involved did their additions for their own reasons. For one person it was political, for another person it was therapeutic, for another person it was for satisfaction, for another person it was to resolve an issue, to find somebody else to hear their problems, to this, to that, interpretation. So every reason for every page was different depending on the artist or the poet that did it. But it's like when you make a most wonderful soup or a most wonderful stew, you put all those different things together and you end up with something that is greater than the sum of the parts. The only way art life was able to exist for as long as it did was by selling the monthly issues every month in bookstores around the country, primarily museum bookstores in major urban areas where people were educated in the arts and they could understand what it was. So number one was sales. In the late 80s, Art Life was the number one selling periodical in the Guggenheim bookstores in New York City. So besides the sales were the subscriptions, the annual subscriptions. And the annual subscriptions went to museums, to libraries, to private people. And Herethus was one of the first subscribers. It was always self-supporting by sales of the issues and subscriptions. I had great freedom in my content because I didn't have to worry about restricting my ideas to the same ideas of religion, corporations, or the government. Those restrictions were removed because they weren't giving me anything, and so I owed them nothing. When you say nonprofit, people think about modern nonprofits. And where I live alone, in Ventura, California, there are over 2,000 nonprofits. And they all have their heads in the trough trying to get the same money for free from the same people, and they have to jump through the circus hoops to get it. So I simplified everything by eliminating that whole idea.